In this podcast episode, Glenn Greenwald joins to discuss the escalating conflict involving Iran and its broader implications, especially the impact on free speech in Western democracies. The conversation delves into how governments, under the pretext of war and security, have been imposing unprecedented restrictions on speech, often in defense of Israel. Greenwald critiques the expanding anti-Semitism laws that severely limit criticism of Israel, the political dynamics fueling these changes, and the troubling influence of pro-Israel lobbying on American and Western policies and society. The episode also touches on the political realignment surrounding Israel in the U.S., the role of the Israel lobby, and the potential risks of this trajectory to American constitutional rights and civil liberties. Greenwald asserts that free speech in Western countries is under more serious threat than ever before. While restrictions on the populist rights expression in Europe have been noted, the more alarming development is the widespread effort to curtail speech critical of Israel. He highlights new laws, especially in Australia, Canada, Europe, and the US, that criminalize common political slogans and opinions about Israel, such as "From the River to the Sea," prosecuting individuals who express them. These laws represent a dangerous transformation where speech codes are crafted not to protect marginalized citizens domestically, but to shield a foreign nation from criticism. As a result, fundamental rights enshrined in constitutions, most notably the U.S. First Amendment, face unprecedented challenges under the guise of combating hate speech. The discussion sheds light on the dramatic expansion of hate speech laws, particularly through institutionalization of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism. Originally created over a decade ago, this definition has been radically broadened to classify a wide range of criticisms of Israel, and even some about Jewish history or religion, as hate speech. Greenwald emphasizes how this has penetrated American universities, where professors and students face repercussions for expressing common political views or conducting academic inquiry concerning Israeli policies. The Trump administration intensified this trend by linking government funding for universities to compliance with these expansive speech codes. This has distorted academic freedom, disproportionately elevated Jewish interests within diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) frameworks, and fired or sidelined faculty members deemed critical of Israel. Greenwald explains how well-funded pro-Israel lobbying groups wield vast influence beyond the U.S., affecting legislation and public discourse in countries like Australia, Canada, and members of the EU. These organizations actively push for legal measures that limit speech critical of Israel and promote aggressive protectionist policies. The podcast recounts how Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly warned Western governments to take tougher stances to protect the Jews, pressuring them to adopt draconian laws. The lobbying operates with an unusual visibility and intensity, coordinating with sympathetic politicians domestically and abroad to shore up Israel's defense within Western political and legal systems, often overriding democratic norms in the process. The episode turns to the political fallout within the United States. Greenwald highlights that support for Israel among younger Americans, including many traditionally conservative youth, is rapidly declining. This shift is forcing political realignments on both the left and right, dismantling the bipartisan consensus that long shielded Israel from criticism. Notably, efforts to repress critiques of Israel have alienated many, fueling resentment and even increasing genuine anti-Semitism as people question the foreign influence on American politics. Meanwhile, the political leadership, including the Democratic establishment, largely supports the current pro-Israel policies, discouraging meaningful opposition or protests against U.S. participation in wars aligned with Israeli interests. A particularly startling development, covered in the podcast, is the proliferation of laws across the majority of U.S. states that condition government contracts, emergency relief, and federal grants on certifications that individuals or organizations do not support boycotting Israel. This tactic effectively punishes and silences dissenters, extending Israeli influence deeply into American economic and social life. Greenwald recounts cases where people lost jobs or funding for refusing to comply. The broad application of these certifications, ranging from hurricane relief to academic grants, illustrates how opposition to Israel's policies has been legally constrained far beyond previously imagined limits. The podcast touches upon Governor Ron DeSantis' controversial travel to Israel to sign legislation impacting Floridians' speech rights related to criticism of Israel. Greenwald stresses how unusual and humiliating it is for an American official to sign laws abroad that bind their own constituents, highlighting concerns about sovereignty and accountability. DeSantis' alignment with Israeli legal frameworks ahead of the Republican primary was seen as an effort to woo hardline pro-Israel groups. Yet, little media attention was given to this development, reflecting the broader pattern of muted scrutiny over increasing speech censorship tied to Israeli interests. While Greenwald strongly condemns anti-Semitism and recognizes its real dangers, he contends that much of the current surge in anti-Semitic sentiment is a reaction to the highly visible, overt pro-Israel lobbying and governmental efforts to suppress criticism. He explains this reaction partly arises from the repeated conflation of Israel and Jews, often used as a rhetorical shield by Israel supporters to dismiss critics as anti-Semitic. This conflation poisons discourse and heightens ethnic and religious tensions. Greenwald compares this dynamic to post-9/11 Islamophobia and warns that equating criticism of Israel with Jewish hatred endangers both free speech and the safety of Jewish communities. Greenwald discusses how the Israel lobby, once overwhelmingly bipartisan and powerful, is now facing a significant political crisis. Shifts within the Democratic Party increasingly marginalize candidates too close to Israel or accepting pro-Israel money, while conservative youth constituencies grow skeptical about fighting wars on Israel's behalf. He predicts that the 2028 Republican presidential primary will likely center heavily on this issue, with candidates challenging the status quo of American support and military involvement for Israel. The older political establishment remains locked in its pro-Israel stance, but generational and ideological changes underpin a profound realignment in U.S. politics. The conversation closes with concerns about the erosion of constitutional protections, especially the possibility of the First Amendment being overridden to punish dissenting opinions. Though American courts still uphold free speech rights, Greenwald warns that political pressures related to war and national security could prompt dangerous exceptions. He highlights historical precedents, such as the Patriot Act after 9/11, to demonstrate how emergency measures become permanent fixtures. The growing integration of speech restrictions with war propaganda and national loyalty narratives increases the risk that criticism of government policies, particularly regarding the Israel-linked war efforts, may be criminalized or suppressed in the future. Greenwald reflects on the unfolding Iran war, noting its rapid onset without meaningful public debate or congressional authorization. He observes the striking reuse of Iraq war rhetoric and personnel, repackaged with the same flawed justifications. Given the war's unpopularity and the absence of organized protests, the situation contrasts sharply with historical anti-war movements. Nevertheless, he foresees this conflict as a catalyst for political shakeup, which, combined with the deeper shifts over Israel-related issues, could precipitate significant changes in the American political landscape. However, he remains uncertain whether these changes will lead to greater freedom or harsher repression in the long term.